We're going to call the meeting to order. This is the committee meeting of the Tennessee Fish and Wildlife Commission. I'm William L. Brown, chairman of the commission. It is Thursday, August 23rd, 2012. Let me give you some instructions, if I may. Everyone that's in attendance, there will be a sign-up sheet passed throughout the room. Be sure and sign your name. If you're here to represent a specific group, put on there who you're representing. The committees will have their meeting today. During the committee meetings, the only ones that can vote are the committee members. They will have a discussion first within the committee. After that, the chairman will open the floor, ask the rest of the commission if there's any questions, and then we'll go to the audience. If anyone in the audience wants to address the commission, please come to the front of the room, center of the room, to the microphone, state your name and your purpose for addressing the commission. I think that's all. Well, not yet. No. And anytime you address the commission, you only do so during the time the commission, the committee is addressing the issues that are before that committee. In other words, if it's wildlife, if you have a matter regarding wildlife to discuss, come to the microphone when the audience is given the opportunity to speak. If it's regarding fisheries, come during the fishery committee discussion. So we want to try to keep it on the subject matter that's being discussed at that time. All right, the first order of business, we will go to the Wildlife Management Committee. Commissioner Teague.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon. My name is Trey Teague, and I'm serving as chairman of the Wildlife Committee. The three major topics we'll discuss today will be the waterfowl season setting, chronic wasting disease importation ban, and an update on the elk tag for this fall. We'll hear a presentation from the staff and take any actions that may be necessary. I'd like to ask commissioners for their input and discussion, and we will be glad to take any comments from the public as well. Just a reminder for the commission that all commissioners are welcome to participate in the discussion, but when we vote today, only the members of the Wildlife Committee may vote. Tomorrow, the committee will make its recommendations, and all commissioners will vote at that time. All right, at this time, I'd like to ask Tim White to come forward and discuss the recommendations for the upcoming waterfowl season.
Thank you, commissioners. I don't know why, I always get a little nervous when I get up here, but hopefully it won't show too bad. Already has, hasn't it? No, sir, I don't quite have that cachet that you do. My name is Tim White. I'm the State Migratory Bird Program Coordinator and Migratory Game Bird Program Coordinator. And this is our annual season setting meeting for the late waterfowl seasons. And that's primarily going to be our October through February, actually through March period. I'm going to discuss a little bit about the federal process involved. To set waterfowl seasons, it's a very involved process. As the Fish and Wildlife Service states, all migratory bird seasons are closed initially. And you can establish a season, a hunting season, as long as you have sound management plans that minimize the risk that hunting seasons will have significant detrimental effects on the population. Some of the requirements that we have to have waterfowl seasons, migratory bird seasons, is development of management plans, breeding ground population surveys, habitat surveys, midwinter counts, on and on, production surveys, banding programs, harvest data collection, part surveys. And then there's a big process of collaboration between the 4 flyways, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Canadian Wildlife Service, where we look at the data, we look at the population models, and we cooperatively, the flyways make recommendations to the Fish and Wildlife Service Regulations Committee, and then they take that up and approve a federal framework that we're allowed to operate under. Bag limits, historically, waterfowl seasons in general were set back in the day, I should say, back in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s. You just have a group of waterfowl experts get in a room. We always call it the smoke field back room, and they would all kind of put their heads together and decide what they thought the seasons ought to be. And the adaptive harvest management process was started somewhere around the mid-'80s, where we actually started to try to make sure science decided what seasons should be. For instance, we know with bag limits, we've learned through decades and decades of banding what the results of certain seasons will be and limits will be. And so each year we try to set our hunting seasons so that we're not impacting waterfowl populations. In other words, we try to be compensatory. And as it stands right now, hunting is a small percentage of mortality for waterfowl. And we try to keep it that way. The main point is that wetland conditions drive waterfowl populations, not hunting. Now we could extend seasons, we could increase bag limits to a point where hunting would be additive and it would affect those populations. But again, we try to keep that conservative. We try not to drive populations down. Now, there are exceptions with snow geese, for instance. We've tried to be as liberal as we can, and we still can't reduce snow goose populations, even killing no bag limits, electronic calls, unplugged guns, and they're still climbing at a pretty rapid rate. If it's all right, we'll pause right quick, and I've got a 6-minute status video. Each year the Fish and Wildlife Service flies the Canadian and U.S. prairies, and we get an idea of habitat conditions and population status. And so we do have a video here.
The following is a presentation of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In cooperation with the Canadian Wildlife Service and other state, provincial, and private conservation partners, the 57th Annual Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey is now complete. In May and June 2012, air crews flew more than 2 million square miles of waterfowl habitat across large segments of the U.S. and Canada. Ground crews surveyed a part of the same area to validate the aerial survey numbers. During the surveys, the pilot biologists and their crews posted their flight observations on the flyways.us website. The crews then worked with biologists from the Migratory Bird Program to summarize habitat conditions, determine breeding population estimates, and draft detailed species reports. This video gives a brief overview of 2012 habitat conditions and waterfowl population estimates across this large survey area. Much more detail and insights from the survey crews are available on the flyways.us website. Habitat conditions were not as good as they were last year. The southern portion of the traditional and eastern survey areas were characterized by a mild winter and an early spring, with average to below average moisture. The total pond estimate for Prairie Canada and the U.S. combined was 5.5 million, which is down 32% from last year. Pond counts in Prairie Canada were down 21%, but remained above the long-term average. Following completion of the survey, the Canadian prairies received above average precipitation, which may improve habitat conditions for later nesters and brood rearing. The U.S. prairie pond count was down 49% from last year, although it remained close to the long-term average. Last year, nearly all of the north-central U.S. was rated as good to excellent. This year, only the Coteau region of North and South Dakota was rated as good, and no areas were rated as excellent. Drastic wetland declines in western South Dakota and Montana resulted in mostly poor to fair habitat conditions in those areas as well. Despite the poorer habitat conditions, population abundance estimates are good for this breeding season. In the Eastern Survey area, which includes Maine, the Maritimes, Quebec, and Eastern Ontario, the estimate for American black ducks was 11% higher than last year. Estimates for mallards, green-winged teal, mergansers, golden eyes, and ring-necked ducks were similar to last year. In the traditional survey area, which includes the north-central United States, south-central and northern Canada and Alaska, the 2012 total duck population estimate was 48.6 million birds, an increase of 7% over last year's estimate. Population abundance estimates were up this year for mallards, canvasbacks, green-winged and blue-winged teal, gadwalls, and northern shovelers, and all remain above the long-term average. The combined lesser and greater scaup estimates were also higher than last year, but only slightly above the long-term average. The American widgeon estimate was similar to last year and is still below the long-term average. Northern pintail numbers decreased this year and are below the long-term average. In general, most Arctic nesting Canada goose and white-fronted goose populations continue to do well and numbers are stable. Similarly, population numbers for Atlantic and Pacific brant, as well as the eastern and western populations of tundra swans, were generally similar to last year. However, populations of most light geese and temperate nesting Canada geese remain overabundant, and their numbers are either stable or increasing. This year, conditions over most of the Arctic were favorable for nesting, except on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta in Alaska, and on Southampton Island in Hudson Bay, where a late spring and severe flooding, respectively, limited production. Overall, the forecast for the production of geese and swans in North America is generally favorable.
Well, while the duck breeding population estimates look good this year, many factors come into play that affect the number of birds that migrate south in the fall. Likewise, when and where waterfowl will be encountered this year depends upon many factors also, including weather, food availability, and local water conditions. All of these will influence duck abundance, distribution, and behavior. While we were very encouraged by the strong increases we saw in a number of species of ducks this year, we remain concerned about the challenges that ducks will face in the future. Many temporary and shallow wetlands were dry this year due to the lack of rain and the mild winters. These wetlands are crucial for successful duck production. Similarly, loss of upland nesting habitats across the prairie pothole regions continues to be a concern for the Fish and Wildlife Service and the conservation community. High commodity prices and other economic factors, coupled with expiring Conservation Reserve Program contracts, have led to an increase in the number of acres of grasslands converted to cropland. Losing nesting habitat for ducks presents a huge challenge to ducks and other wildlife. Hunters and birdwatchers alike should be very encouraged by the number of ducks this year, but we must not take our eyes off the conservation challenges that lay ahead.
For more information about the population and habitat
Overall, it's a pretty rosy picture, what we got going this year. A little graph right here shows a little bit about where we get our birds. The majority of our birds come from Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario, but we also pick up some birds from Alberta, North Dakota, even Wisconsin. We pick up wood ducks from Pennsylvania and Kentucky. So, but the three big players from where Tennessee gets its birds are Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario by far. Again, they talked about the numbers of birds in the video this year, 48.6 million. I don't know if you noticed on the graph, but that's the highest number that since we've been recording population data for the number of birds. So it's the highest number of ducks in the spring that we've had, again, since at least the 1950s. And although the May pond count was down from last year, it was still pretty good. It was still 9% above the long-term average. And looking at the DU Canada and talking to Dave Kosterski up there, they've had great rainfall since the May pond counts were conducted. And so the wetlands are in great shape. Brood rearing should be really good. Survival should be good. Second nest attempts and late nesters also looking really good. Even without that rainfall, we weren't in bad shape. It was just not quite as historic as last year. Again, the graph shows the total number of birds this year, and you can see the spike over there is pretty significantly higher than what we've ever had before. Again, the wetland maps show last year how good it was. This year, although it's not great, still the prime area from the blue area down through the central part of North Dakota is green when this map was made in May. So it was still pretty good habitat even before the rains. And this shows the August conditions right. You're looking at this map, it shows the August conditions reported by DU, and they've improved considerably. Last year's harvest figures was a slow year for us last year. It was pretty warm, fairly dry. We harvested about 196,000 ducks, and that's down from last year. The average hunter took about 9 duck hunting trips in the season and harvested 2.5 ducks per day. And the harvest per day is actually pretty good over time compared to other states. Goose hunters averaged about 8.5 trips per season and harvested about 3 geese per season. And a point to make about our Canada geese, a lot of you may not know, but we don't really get any significant migratory Canada geese anymore. 99% of our Canada goose harvest is resident birds. And so the days of the migrant Canada goose are pretty much past us. On a super cold winter, we're going to pick up a few, but not very many. The most migratory Canada goose we're going to pick up is a resident bird out of Kentucky on occasion. So. This shows our total duck harvest over time. Last year, again, wasn't a great year, although it was still better than years back in the early days. You can see how since the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, our duck harvest has gone way up, and I think we can attribute that to the refuge system we started in the mid-80s. It allowed us to hold a lot more birds over time. Here's an indication of that, our midwinter survey, which is done every year, first week of January. All the states in the country do it the same week. It's a snapshot of where birds are over time. And you can see in the last 6 years, 7 years, we've set 4 of those years has been the highest midwinter count we've ever had. So I think that's pretty strong evidence that we are holding more birds, and that's probably due to having refuges in place that allow birds a place to escape pressure, and it distributes that harvest over a greater area. And someone asked me one time, well, are you taking birds away from Reelfoot and Kentucky Lake? Well, we look at band returns prior to our refuge system, and there was a cluster of band returns around Reelfoot and a cluster around Tennessee National and Kentucky Lake. Very few anywhere else. And now when you look at that same band return map, there's the same cluster around Reelfoot, the same cluster around Kentucky Lake, and they're also everywhere else, spread up and down the river systems. So it's not that we're really taking birds from other places. We're just holding birds more from other states in general over time. So that's good. And for information, our most important species that we harvest, primarily mallards, gadwalls. Wood duck is usually third in our bag, followed by green-winged teal. And then the rest of the birds on down don't play a very significant part of what we harvest. Early season frameworks. I understood there may have been some questions about our September wood duck teal season, so I thought I'd address that now. Our early seasons are actually set during the May period. It's considered an early season species, an early waterfowl season. So that's set in May, and it's kind of a little different federal process. The feds have early season selections and late season selections, and they're set at different times of the year. But currently, there are only 3 states that have a wood duck and teal season in September. Most states have a 16-day teal season only. The reason Tennessee has, I'll talk a little bit about it. In 1980, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Florida petitioned for an experimental wood duck season, somewhere around 1980. The service allowed us the experimental season as long as we had some extensive banding and we could monitor survival rates. In 2001, the service was just uncomfortable that they just didn't have a management plan for wood ducks. And they were uncomfortable with our season, so they tried to cancel the 3 states' seasons. But there was no evidence. We'd been going along for over 20 years with not any change in survival rates at all. And it actually had a congressman from Kentucky step in, and some other people, Trent Lott, I think, got involved, and suddenly our season was made operational. So we're the only 3 states that have the teal wood duck season. It is a source of controversy a little bit at the flyways because most of the states would like to have our season, but they didn't jump on board early on, and they didn't band birds and do the things necessary to have it. So we're the only ones that have this particular season. During 2011, last year, we harvested about 6,000 blue wings during that 5-day season and about 16,000 wood ducks during that season. A few years ago, we did finally get a management plan in place for wood ducks where we were able to have a population model that allowed us to actually predict wood duck populations. They're tough to survey. You can't survey them like other waterfowl because they're spread out all over the country. They're in wooded areas. They're different than most other waterfowl. So our analysis indicated that we could increase our harvest of wood ducks and that they could sustain that without being impacted. So we were able to add a 3rd wood duck to the bag during the late season a number of years ago, and we've seen stable wood duck populations in the 3 years since, so it doesn't seem to have any impact. Some people ask why we can't have a 3rd wood duck during the September season, and we're a little bit more concerned about the September season simply because in September we're shooting our ducks, and in December we're shooting their ducks, and we can have a greater impact on our birds, whereas during the late winter we're getting birds from all over the place, and it's not as big an impact. So. And these 2 graphs kind of show our wood duck versus teal. This is a 5-year average. This probably paints a pretty good picture. On an average year, we harvest about 14,000 wood ducks during that 5 days and about 4,000 blue-winged teal. One thing right now, we don't really have an option of changing and adding teal days. The Fish and Wildlife Service Kentucky and Tennessee have both asked the past couple of years about the possibility of adding days, and right now that's not an option. They told us that we could drop our wood duck season and go with 16 days of teal, but considering how widespread wood duck harvest is across the state and how many more we harvest, we didn't feel like that would probably be a very popular option. So the service is undertaking a blue-winged teal harvest assessment study right now, and that's supposed to come out in January. And if that assessment shows that there is some more potential for harvest of blue wings, we're going to, again, request to add at least 4 more days onto our 5-day season. That way we could run Saturday through the following Sunday, but the last 4 days would be teal only. And that's our first, hopefully they'll give us that, but it'll be next year before we can really explore that opportunity. So, but that's something we would really like to do. We think it would be popular. Blue wing numbers are really high, so. And anytime you have a question along the way, please stop me. And also, I know someone had a question about doves. Does anybody want to bring that up now while I'm talking about these early migratory species? Commissioner Rice?
Yes, sir. My question was, I think we've had a season in the past that allowed for 18 doves. Would it be possible to go back to that? I know that was several years ago.
No, sir, I don't think it would be an option. About 5 years ago, the Fish and Wildlife Service came to all the flyway states and said we need a management plan for mourning doves. Some of the data was showing that mourning doves were in decline. So all the states got together at the regulatory process. It's called the Eastern Management Unit for doves. There's a Central and a Western Management Unit. But the different management units with the Fish and Wildlife Service developed a management plan. And at the time, some states, all the states had an option of going with 12 doves and 70 days or 15 doves and 60 days. And we had been selecting the 60 days and 15 for a number of years. And so they wanted to be consistent, so the management plan allowed all the states to go with 70 days and 15, so that was a slight liberalization in days. But right now, our only options go through 15. Dove populations, well, I take that back. There is an option in the plan that allows it to go to 18, but dove populations themselves have to trigger that. They have to really increase at a pretty good rate. And to be honest, right now, dove populations are either stable or declining in most states. In Tennessee, they're stable, but there's some other states where they're in decline. And so the potential for an increase right now is probably not in the cards. Does that answer your question? Yes, sir.
Is our agency involved or participating in the meetings that are studying or discussing banning lead shot for dove?
Yes, sir. It's, the committees don't necessarily study those, they review studies that other people do. And the Fish and Wildlife Service was going to do a survey this year of hunters about their preference on and what they thought about it. And for some reason, they canceled that study this past fall. I think some politics got involved. And so right now, there's still a lot of debate. There's still, some states think lead is completely bad. Some think that it's not an issue. Personally, I'm somewhere in between.
Have you been to the meeting?
Yes, sir. I most of them. I don't go to all of them. Once a year, they meet in late February. And so, but I'm involved in all the discussions, all the emails, and what's going on.
Has anybody ever studied why Mexico and Argentina have shoot obviously more lead shot than we do? And
Well, that's
have
one.
been doing it for years, and their populations are huge.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of the issues. I think the biggest issue some of the states have is just philosophically putting tons of lead out there in their mind is a bad thing. But again, the only studies I've seen have shown that if you put a dove in a pen and you feed him lead shot, he'll eat it and he'll die. Well, that doesn't really tell me anything. You know, and as you know about dove fields, once you shoot them pretty hard, most of the birds are going to be gone. There's not a lot of subsequent feeding, even if it is. Again, are they going to select a lead shot over a seed that they're familiar with? There's so many unknowns right now that there's not really going to be anything done immediately, anytime soon, until some of these things get worked out. But it's still a lot of debate on that, raging debate. Yes, sir. All right, moving on. Again, these doves are like this early wood duck season that's set in the May period, and so it's just an informational thing to discuss it. With that, after all the different collaboration and the flyway work and the surveys and the banding and everything we've done, it leads us to this. We finally get a federal framework which allows us to select our seasons. We have a 60-day season allowed. The last Sunday in January, which will be January 27th, is our closure date, and we can kill 6 ducks per day, of which we can kill 4 mallards, 2 of which can be females. We can kill 3 wood ducks, 2 redheads. The scaup bag limit increased from 2 to 4. We don't kill very many scaup in the state of Tennessee. And we do recommend adoption of these bag limits. These are our waterfowl zones. We have 2. We have a statewide zone and a reelfoot zone. And the reelfoot zone consists of the waters of Reelfoot Lake. The proposed seasons that the agency is proposing this year will be similar to last year. We're allowed to have 2 segments of the season. Our first segment for the statewide zone is Thanksgiving weekend, the Saturday and Sunday, as we've done in years past. And the second segment would open this following Saturday, December 1, and run to January 27. And again, that makes use of all 60 days and the maximum number of weekends that we can get in. The Reelfoot zone would be their traditional opener, November 10, 11, and again, December 1 to January 27th. And the Gallinoodles, Moorhens, Virginian sorrel rails all mirror those seasons. This is just kind of a picture of the calendar of what it looks like when the openings are. Reelfoot, statewide, both zones open in December. The closing date's January 27. Our youth waterfowl season allowed us a change this year. In years past, we had to have 2 consecutive days for our youth hunt. This past season, the Fish and Wildlife Service allowed you to separate those 2 days so that you don't have to be consecutive. We did. We put out a press release asking for input from the public on potentially moving it to 2 Saturdays instead of the 1 Saturday, Sunday. And we got all positive response. I personally have not had one negative comment about it. It allows us to have those 2 Saturdays, which allows you to plan specifically for organized hunts. If you have bad weather one weekend, it allows you to get out a different weekend. And we just felt like that it would be better hunting to have 5 days off, a day of youth season, another 5 days off, and another youth hunt. And as most of you probably know, that period after season closes, the ducks leave the refuges and scatter out on the area on the landscape. So the youth hunts are almost always really good that Saturday. So we're proposing to go with the 2 Saturdays following duck season, and that would be February 2nd and February 9. And that would be for both zones. We even asked some of the Reelfoot folks up there what they wanted, and they said they'd like to go with the same thing, the 2 Saturdays. So that's what we're proposing this year. Our goose season recommendations are going to be fairly similar to last year with some expansions. We were allowed to add some days this year. We were allowed to increase our Canada goose limit in the late season from 2 to 3. That was significant. And we were also allowed to add 6 days to that season. Let me back up. These are the bag limits. The season for brant is pretty standard. We don't kill any brant, but we have to set a season. White-fronted geese, again, it's December 1 to February 10. That allows us to hunt as late as possible for white fronts. By closing the 10th, we're able to open our conservation season for snow geese. We can't ever open the conservation provisions until all seasons have been closed. So we typically time those goose seasons in right with that youth hunt so that as soon as the youth hunts and everything's over, we can go right into the snow goose conservation hunting. All right. Our Canada goose seasons this year proposed. We were able to add 6 days. The statewide zone, the days were added to October. It allows us 3 splits. We're October 13 to 30. November 24 and 5 is our duck opener, so we can kill geese then. And then December 1 to January 27th, that coincides with our duck season. And it's kind of different. The Northwest Canada Goose Zone, which is this area on the map up here, that area historically had a later closing date. We're not allowed to go later with our statewide zone, but in this zone we were allowed to go on into February. So that's why that date's a little later when you see February 10th as a closure. Prior to this year, they only had a December 1 to February 10 season. The Fish and Wildlife Service allowed 6 more days of hunting, so we added 2 days so that they can kill geese during their opening duck weekend. And we added 4 days into October, so now they'll have some October hunting for resident birds up there during that period of time. So it's all additions to what they already had. Again, blue snow and Ross geese from November 24th to February 10th will be allowed to hunt snow geese, but you can't use any conservation provisions. It's normal regulations. Starting the 11th through March 10, we're allowed to use electronic calls and unplug guns for snow geese. Well, with that being said, as commissioners, you're going to hear from one year to the next, depending on how good the duck season is, complaints about northern states holding birds and short stopping and warmer winters. And I thought this little slide might provide just a little perspective. I think the time's coming when these men will insist on more and better answers than have yet been given by the Wildlife Service or Ducks Unlimited to the question, what has happened to our waterfowl? It's resulted in mallards remaining longer in the Midwest during their migrations. Mallards now winter north of their former wintering areas, which is what we hear a lot. And that's from 1949. So it's duck hunters are kind of the same over time. And lastly, I wanted to, again, welcome you all. If you don't have big plans tonight, Commissioner Woodson and I would be glad to entertain you maybe at the Wilson County Fair. That's going on tonight. We're right proud of the county fair. It's the 34th largest fair in North America. And I don't know how that slide got in there. Oh, okay, I'm sorry about that. I was going to take questions.
I had one on the youth hunt.
Yes, sir.
And I'm probably wrong on my numbers, but is the young sportsman's license, can you not have one of them tier 16?
Young
Somebody answer
sportsman's
that?
license.
You can buy it before you turn 16 and hunt them,
Okay.
even though you turn 16.
So you can have a young sportsman's license, be a youth hunter at 16, but why are we limited it to 15? I mean, just,
That's the Fish and
Fish and
Wildlife
Wildlife?
Service regs.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
as answered my question.
Unfortunately, because I guess they require them to buy a migratory bird stamp at 16. So,
I really have a comment instead of a question. About a year ago, I voiced my concern at a commission meeting about the lack of dove fields in West Tennessee, private lease lands and not having the opportunity for youth to hunt. I'm proud to say since then, and I was going to wait till tomorrow, but since we have such a big crowd today and Dan Fuqua and Jim Hamilton's here today, I want to brag on Alan Peterson and his staff, Jim and Dan, for the effort they've made in the fields. If you don't believe it, just get on the website, go on Facebook and check it out. But gentlemen, I appreciate you, appreciate the effort you made, and people in West Tennessee do too. Thank you.
that's outstanding. And if while I'm up here, it's dove season, as you know, is getting ready to start, and we do have a dove field program. And I'm also the dove biologist, so right now we're in the midst of leasing fields. We're hard after it. We're leasing fields every day right now. So I don't really have an update other than what you mentioned. Region 1 is, well, I believe all the regions have had some success, and we'll be leasing fields right up through next week. For those that don't know, we do have a website, the agency website on the front page, how to find a dove field. You can click on your region that you live in, and it lists all the wildlife management area fields and the lease fields with directions, information about the field. So we are in the process right now of leasing fields, and we're only a little over a week away. Yes, sir.
I have one question. I understand.
Sir, do you mind approaching the microphone? State your names for the cameras.
Yeah, my name is Rick Brandon, and I'm here just kind of as an interested observer, also active production limited. But my curiosity was, with the population being somewhat at an all-time high for recent memory, the regulations really haven't changed very much on the duck for this year. Is there a number you think that we'd have to get to either add days to the season or add birds to the harvest?
I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. The Mississippi Flyway is by far the biggest flyway, and we harvest the lion's share of ducks, more so than all the other flyways combined. And the adaptive harvest management process that we've been under for, 15, 16 years, its most liberal option is 60 days and 6 ducks. And there's been talk over time in some of the years, not long ago when the wetlands weren't as good, and that maybe we should scale back voluntarily, even though the models kept saying liberal, liberal, liberal. But again, it seems to be working, and I don't think it would be something that the Fish and Wildlife Service would entertain. It's just, I think most of them already think the seasons are too liberal, but they can't really change them at this point. I think there are several biologists in the service that have stated that they'd like to see us scale back to a 50-day season and 4 ducks. For no other reason than they felt like it was a human's dimensions issue, that it created false expectations for hunters to always have these liberal seasons. But our standpoint is again, we try to provide as much opportunity as we can without harming those resources. So I don't really see any mechanism to increase beyond 60 days right now.
Okay.
It would be something we would always want. Some of the other flyways do have more days and more ducks. And I'm sure every state in the Mississippi Flyway would like to have a longer season and more birds. The Central Flyway, I think, has a 100-day season, something like that, 107 days, something crazy. But they don't kill very many birds, so I guess it kind of plugs into it. And again, then the fact that we kill so many in this flyway and have so many hunters, it's just not much chance, I don't think. Hope that answered your question.
We're going to take a short break. We're not going anywhere, just to give Mr. King time to